Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Today we have with us former Managing Director General of ADB, Asian Development Bank, Rajat M, to discuss what has been the newly created, at least announcement of the BRICS Bank. What does it mean? What are the implications are for not only the economy of the world but also the political economy of the world? These are the issues that we'll be taking up. Rajat, this announcement has been some time in the coming. There has been a preparations for it. There is the BRICS Bank and also there is supposed to be a reserve fund. So what do these two things really signify?
I think at a fundamental level it signifies the shift of the soft power from the west to the east. The center of gravity of the economy, financial and economic strength is definitely moving inexorably eastwards. Asia now accounts for about 27% of the global GDP. In another about 30 years, it will be over 50%. The BRICS Bank that you mentioned comprises of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. These 5 countries account for roughly about 25% now of global GDP. But just about 10 years back, it was only about 9%. So it's a huge growth. So what BRICS Bank, I think, reflects is the reality of the growth of the economic power of these countries, but them not getting commensurate importance or a place at the global table. Creation of the BRICS Bank, I think, is basically the world changing, the emerging economies becoming much more important. The BRICS, for example, account for 42% of the world's population. So it reflects the failure, in one sense, of the existing institutions not being able to accommodate the aspirations of these countries, and therefore them saying, well, look, then we'll have to just create our own space.
Two things over here. One is the reserve fund that is being created.
Right.
Shall we consider it something equivalent to the IMF? Is it for specifically bailing out economy?
That's the idea, that look, if any of the countries get into trouble, then there is this pool of currency which will be drawn upon. Yes, the idea is that if any particular country gets into trouble,
and a short-term trouble.
In a short-term trouble, exactly, short-term balance of payments crisis. But I have to say, and this is where the devil is in the details, $100 billion for a group of countries which includes China, India, Russia and Brazil and South Africa is going to be awfully inadequate. But I don't think it's the money which is the point. The signal has been given that the BRICS countries are saying, look, we will start having an arrangement in which we will control our destiny in that sense.
But it is more for helping others out rather than themselves. Because as you said, 100 billion is peanuts for China, for instance, or now, even for India today.
This is one thing which is not clear, and I think that is part of the process that the BRICS countries will go through over the next couple of years. The details. Now, is the BRICS Bank only for the BRICS countries, or is BRICS Bank for other emerging economies, and therefore global? Because in the sense of the Asian Development Bank is for Asia, the African Development Bank is for Africa, Latin America is covered by Inter-American Development Bank. But the important thing, as far as I'm concerned, about the BRICS Bank and the CRA is a statement of intentions and aspirations, and a reflection, I would say, of the frustration these countries have felt, and very justifiably, of the governance structure of the present arrangements. And therefore they're saying, look, we'll now have to create something where we can decide what will happen.
So the issue still remains whether it's for the BRICS or for other countries as well. So that's not clear.
That's not clear, though I understand that the proposal is to open it up to other countries. Other countries can join, and that the lending of the BRICS Bank will not be only for the BRICS countries but others as well, particularly in the infrastructure space. But those are the details which I think have to be worked out.
So you were also talking about the unequal nature of the governance of the financial institutions of the world. Basically, in this case, the IMF and the World Bank being the two key ones, apart from the regional banks as well. Now, in this, what were the key problems that you think happened and which drove these countries in this direction?
I think the political institutions always have difficulty in keeping pace with the economic changes. And the economic changes have been phenomenal. As I was mentioning, the BRICS countries have gone from being under 10%, 9% of the global GDP in 2003 to over roughly about 25% now. The political arrangements in, say, the Bretton Woods institution, also the regional banks, reflected a shareholding which is 40, 50, 60 years old. It has changed, no question about it, but changed marginally. For example, in the IMF, Belgium has a larger shareholding than Brazil, and Brazil's economy is several times that of Belgium. Now, the political institutions have difficulty adjusting to that. So countries like Brazil, certainly countries like China and India, are saying, hey, look, this was okay, maybe even 40 years back or even 30 years back, but it's not okay now. So can we have some more say in the governance? Can we have a larger place at the table? And I think the shareholdings didn't respond as rapidly as obviously these countries wanted, and therefore they said, look, if we can't make the changes we want to see, then we'll have to go and set up our own institution. I personally think it's unfortunate because there are limited resources, both financial and human. So create another institution will obviously not be easy, but I can see why the BRICS countries felt that was the only way to go to give shape to their aspirations.
There is also the other part of it, the politics of the world. And there's no question that IMF and World Bank have really, in some sense, tailored their lending according to the interests of the political players, and key among them being the United States. So the fact that IMF is bailing out Ukraine right now when they have a civil war, and the fact that the IMF bailout itself was a part of the issue which led to the East and other parts of Ukraine coming at loggerheads. All of this shows that the IMF, World Bank do play a political role. It's just not an economic role.
Well, I think our charter, as our, since I was with the ADB till recently, is apolitical.
Suppose it.
Okay. But I've always said, and I've said this very publicly, we are apolitical, but our owners are very political. And our owners are countries, and therefore, you're right, countries such as the US and Japan in ADB's case, US and Europe in case of the World Bank, IMF, they obviously, because of their shareholdings, exert influence on the institution's policy and the direction of the institutions. And this is exactly what countries on the receiving end, the emerging economies, basically were resisting. They were saying, we don't have a problem of these institutions demanding things of us in terms of, say, project implementation or good governance or environmental standards, so long as they are our views as well. And we feel, we the emerging economies feel, that we don't have enough seat at the table to influence that. And they tried, and they're still trying. But I have to be fair that I think the governance changes have happened in the World Bank, IMF, but for the purposes of the emerging economies, too slowly. And I think
glacial pace.
Yes, slowly.
Whatever you call it,
right.
Really very
and I
slowly.
think the countries such as India and China started to feel that, look, this pace is too slow for us.
One part of it is what the emerging economies feel. Other part of it is, of course, what the ones who are not emerging economies feel, and they do, or they have felt, that the IMF structural adjustment programs have been devastating for them. The fact that they have got their agriculture oriented towards exports, the food security is threatened, you import food and export something else. All this has been extremely damaging for instance, the African countries. And of course, the fact that you're then dependent on the trade terms, which have gone adversely against some of the countries. So all this put together has meant that the IMF has acted almost as an instrument of politics of America and the European Union.
I would have to respectfully disagree with you. The views expounded are not sort of, black and white. There are problems, but there are also problems with protectionism. there are also problems with food security if it's taken to an illogical extreme that everybody thinks they must produce all the food that they need. There is something called trade, there is something called terms of trade. So I'm not getting in the merits of those as such, but your general point is valid that the structural adjustment loans were seen to be imposed on them. And my point is, without going to the merits of a particular structural adjustment program, the only way they would succeed, I feel, and only places they have succeeded is when it is not seen as a program imposed from the outside, whether it's IMF or World Bank or anybody, but it is something that the countries themselves have made. There have been some very important structural adjustments necessary in many of these countries, but the only places they've really succeeded is when it has been organic, when they have made those changes. And sometimes the perception that has been thrust on them has made it politically very difficult for these countries to do it.
And therefore, Rajat, I have this entire problem, which I'll come to the BRICS as well. I have this entire problem that here you have people sitting in the IMF who generally have not been very successful in the countries they have practiced their economics and have been exported to the IMF, coming out of the blueprint which doesn't change in iota whichever country they go to. So essentially it is identical, just you change the name of the countries and you put a few other things and that becomes the IMF structural adjustment program. This has been the blueprint which has been followed by the IMF, which even, for instance, people like Stiglitz and all have been very critical of.
I think if you look at IMF's own evaluation, they would agree that their prescriptions have sometimes been one size fits all, and that is not the case. Certainly in the Asian financial crisis, the prescription needed for handling the crisis, I'm talking about 97, 98, was certainly not appropriate if we brought in what was happening in Latin America. In Asia, for example, we didn't have fiscal deficits, we had fiscal surpluses. Therefore, to come in and say that we need to tighten the expenditures was the wrong prescription, and IMF, I think, would be the first to admit, and they have admitted that.
After the event,
but I think to be fair to them, they have recognized that that was the wrong prescription. But my point is that the global governance structure of these institutions have not kept pace with the growing economic and therefore, I would hope, political importance of the emerging economies. And the BRICS Bank is a reflection of that. Now, there are going to be challenges in the implementation of the BRICS Bank, and we can talk about that if you wish. The devil is in the details. But I am fully supportive of this political aspiration that this is the only way these countries could, in fact, assert their growing economic influence, which they felt was not being reflected in the institutions.
Agreed, and I think that's the reason that the BRICS countries felt they were not getting their due.
Right.
Also, the fact that dollar being the world's reserve currency gives a certain weight to US, which may be out of proportion to what they should enjoy today. And the fact that you are also imposing financial sanctions on countries who did not bow to the US sanctions, for instance, on Iran, and now Russia itself is being sanctioned. So there's a whole set of things which are happening which are outside the financial institution sphere, but which has an impact on the financial system as such. But the key issue for me is, in fact, two sets of issues. One is, what will be the currency?
For the BRICS Bank.
For the BRICS Bank.
Right.
Because if it is exactly the same, the dollar denominated, everything is dollar denominated, the de facto political power of the dollar, the US, continues in the financial system. Do you think there is also, therefore, a move towards moving away from the dollar in some sense?
Again, I don't know how it will emerge, but my feeling is that the BRICS Bank's currency, principal currency, will be the dollar. Partly because the borrowings in the international capital markets are also, not exclusively, but principally in dollar. I'm sure they will raise funds in euros and, renminbi or yen. So the dollar will remain, I think, a currency of great importance as a reserve currency for the foreseeable future. We had at the ADB some years back talked about the possibility of an Asian currency unit. And I think that is the way the world will move. It will be a basket of currencies, which of course was the origin of the SDR. But leaving that aside, the idea would be that you'd have the Chinese renminbi, the Japanese yen, the Indian rupee, you would have the euro, you'll have the dollar. Because I think it will be inconceivable to think of a world financial arrangement without the dollar. But I think you will probably see the growing importance of the others being reflected in a basket of currencies. Now, there's going to be a huge process of this adjustment. And how do you settle trade? I mean, you have to settle trade in a currency or a basket of currencies. But I think the world will have to move towards that basket of currencies, reflecting again the basket of economies which are growing in importance. I mean, it's not going to be a dollar-centric world, and therefore, in due course, it cannot be a dollar-centric reserve. But when will this multi-currency, multi-basket happen? Time will tell. But I had gone public saying that we will not see the AQ, the Asian Currency Unit, till about 2050, and I still hold that view.
We will not see it before 2050, or we'll see it be a reality in 2050?
I would think reality by 2050. I think you will see parts of it coming in, exactly the point you raised. When you have a BRICS Bank, I think the question you raised is a very perceptive one. People would say you created the BRICS Bank to be able to have an alternative arrangement, and yet your currency of operation is the dollar. But I think there's no other alternative. But they will talk, I think, in terms of a greater local currency financing, for example. I mean, why can't we, if we're going to finance an infrastructure project in India, why not sort of have an arrangement that BRICS would raise rupee funds in India to be lent in rupees? So I think there will have to be some fairly innovative, forward-thinking discussions on these.
But this, therefore, is an indication that the existing financial institutions, really the Bretton Woods system and the reserve currency of the dollar, both these are in some sense under challenge by the BRICS, and hopefully, if they can get the others, by other countries joining in as well. Would you see this as an indication of that?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, see, the dynamics of the global economy are changing. And the very fact that I had given you figures about the absolute, during the period 2003 to 2009, if I remember correctly, the BRICS countries accounted for 65% of the growth in the global economy. And as you and I were talking earlier, during the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, it was really China and to some extent India and the other emerging economies which really bailed the world out. And had it not been for China having a massive fiscal expansion program, the world would have probably seen fairly dark days. So I think you're going to see this dilemma playing out in all of these discussions, including the role of the dollar as a reserve currency. But I think the dollar as a reserve currency for the foreseeable future is a given. But yeah, I think these are the issues which will have to be discussed.
That's an interesting point you made about China bailing the world out.
Right.
Because essentially everywhere else, Europe
Right.
and the United
Right.
States, was fiscal conservatism,
Right.
cut expenditure.
Right.
While actually China would have
Right.
followed the Keynesian prescription
Right.
of expanding.
Exactly.
And the global economy really then responded
Right.
to this Keynesian
Right.
proposition of
Right.
expanding
Right.
what they did, build infrastructure
Right.
and so on.
Right.
The last question, and it's really linked to my earlier one about IMF, perception of IMF structural adjustment program and so on. Do you think the BRICS Bank will, in that sense, have a philosophy, the economic philosophy will be different? Because if you look at, for instance, what these countries are, Brazil, India, South Africa, all three are following neoliberal prescriptions of some kind or the other,
Right.
which is really fiscal conservatism,
Right.
not expanding the deficit
Right.
and so on. This
Right.
is one part
Right.
of it. So if they follow the what shall I say, the fiscal book, the
Right.
Bible of the IMF, World
Right.
Bank, if you will, it would not really make much of a difference to the really
Right.
poorer countries who are the receiving end today.
Well, I have to recast that a bit. I think it's not a question of IMF philosophy or not. It is more a question of, I would say, almost economics 101. And the economics 101 would basically say that, look, somewhere, not necessarily at every point in time, you have to live within your means. And countries have to do the same, just as you and I have to do. So the fiscal conservatism is not a IMF prescription. I think this is basically what could be called fiscal prudence. But that does not mean that you cannot and must not have a role for greater fiscal expenditure, say on infrastructure, which is what China did. The reason China is doing so well now, that starting in the 80s, they made massive investments in infrastructure, which was fiscally very demanding, and therefore they had to run obviously large fiscal deficits. So I think the BRICS Bank, again, I don't know what they will do, but my feeling is that they will follow the principles of Economics 101. However,
of course, Economics 101 as taught in Chicago and other places is not identical.
No,
so you have to.
But the principles will not be that much different.
Rajat, I think
No.
the point that you're making is a very important one. Fiscal deficit, provided you can finance it in the future. So your growth must be such out of the deficit you run today that the deficit can be
by
better
when
in the
is a
future.
question. Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, you can have a fiscal deficit for a certain period, but it can't be forever, and it can't also be totally unsustainable. But the greater point you have raised, which I think is a very, and again, I don't know what the answer is. And this is where, as I keep saying, I am, unequivocally a great supporter of the BRICS Bank concept. But the details will be very important. One will be exactly what you have said. 5 countries, equal share. So whose views will prevail? The idea is nobody's, therefore a consensus. The second one, Probir, which I think the institution, the BRICS Bank will have to deal with, is its business model. See, at the moment, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, basically operates on a very simple business model. The credit rating of the institution is actually higher than its members because of the collective strength and the so-called callable capital. So the bondholders know that if there is a problem for the institution to repay its loans, its bondholders, the countries, the shareholders will cough up the money. Now, and that is because there are countries, in ADB's case, 67 member countries, all Asia, Europe, all of North America. In the BRICS Bank, if it's these 5 countries, what will be the credit rating of this institution in the international market? Number one. Number two, if the credit rating isn't high, and if the institution can't borrow money cheaper than what its member countries do, then what is the benefit? See, ADB borrows money at a rate cheaper than any of our borrowing countries. We add a spread and we can lend on. So these are the sort of details which the BRICS Bank will have to. So first, as you said, is the economic policy. Second, which I think is equally important, is going to be the financial model. How do you generate the funds? You can't lend money out of equity. I mean, no matter how much equity you have, it will run out. And the third will be, you don't want to be seen to be imposing strict conditionalities for obvious reasons. But on the other hand, you want to impose discipline of fiscal management. You want to impose disciplines of the environmental standards. You don't want to get into a situation that you're building infrastructure without really knowing if it's sustainable. Therefore, the whole issue of implementation. So there are details which the BRICS Bank will have to work out, and those are still on the drawing board. But my feeling is that these countries will, in the next couple of years, have to come to grips with it. It's doable, but just because the BRICS Bank has been announced doesn't mean that all of these will get solved automatically. So there are still some challenges, but overall, the establishment of the BRICS Bank, going back to the fundamental point you made, is, I think, a signal of the emerging economies that they are dissatisfied with the present arrangement of governance and want their own say.
Interesting also, because when you started by saying that that kind of program which is done with the consent of the state, taking into account its own requirements, is much more likely to be successful than the kind of externally imposed one-size-fits-all programs which these institutions did. And because they are relatively politically weaker than the United States and the IMF and the World Bank, which grew out of the Bretton Woods, that they are more likely to be more sensitive to these issues, hopefully.
Hopefully, very much so. Certainly in the ADB, my experience there was that whenever it was a program we designed which reflected the reality on the ground, and therefore we treated each country differently, and their capacities are different. I mean, you might have a very good prescription, But if the institutional capacity in that country cannot bear it, then it will be counterproductive to ask for that. And they have worked. I mean, so I hope very much that the BRICS Bank, even more so than the regional banks, would be able to reflect these realities.
Thank you very much, Rajat. We'll come again on these issues
Yes,
to see how
absolutely.
the BRICS banks develops.
Yes, absolutely.
The devil as it comes out in the detail.
Thank you very much. Thank you.